Chapter 4, Accessing Risk and Impact on Access Control. Learning objectives and key concepts. Learning objectives define proper security controls and techniques to mitigate risk and threats in an IT infrastructure. Key concepts. Terms and concepts involved with risk assessment and control. Risk, threats and vulnerabilities of an IT infrastructure. Qualitative and quantitative risk assessment, risk management strategies, how value, situations, and liability affect risk assessment. Risk definitions and concepts. 1 of 3. Risk, measured in terms of probability of impact. Assessment value, the relative value, monetary or qualitative, of the resources being protected. Threat, an adverse event that may jeopardize the security of organizations, its information systems, or its data. Taking risk, introduction, potential, innovation, and grow an organization. Goals to manage risk may make informed decisions, mitigate risks, avoid risk, transfer risk, accept risk. Risk's definition and concepts. 2 of 3. Vulnerability, a known or unknown weakness in the system design. Probability of occurrence, the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. Impact, the impact an organization should risk materializing. Control, a technical, physical, or administrative process designed to reduce risk. Risk definition and concepts. 3 of 3. Risk assessment, first step is designing any access control system. Determine which risks exist in the environment or may occur in the future. Measure level of risks by calculating the probability of occurrence and the potential impact on the environment. High probability, high impact. Threats and vulnerabilities. Access control threats cannot be completely eliminated. New threats are constantly being devised. Security professionals try to minimize the impact by eliminating vulnerability. Risk assessment helps determine which threats present the biggest impact. Access threats, password cracking, guessing or deciphering passwords. Heightened access, ability of an attacker to log into a system under one level of access and exploit the vulnerability to gain a higher level of access. Use of manipulation or trickery to convince authorized users to perform actions or divulge sensitive information. Access control vulnerabilities, insecure passwords, insecure storage, insecure password hashes, insecure applications that run at a too high of privilege level and users. Risk assessment. Use formal risk assessment to identify addressing each risk. Quantitative involves numeric data of calculations to identify and rank the risk facing organizations. Qualitative relies upon expert opinions rather than mathematical equations. Quantitative risk assessment. Quantitative risk assessment relies on a numeric value and calculation to identify the rank of risks. Step 1. Determine asset value, AV. For each asset in the scope of work, replacement cost. What does it cost to replace if damaged or lost? Purchase cost. What is the original cost? Depreciation. The original cost reduced by the age factor. Step 2. Determine the exposure factor. For each risk divided by assessment part, expected amount of damage if risk occurs. This is normally expressed as a percentage. Identify the annual rate of occurrence by determining the likelihood a risk will occur in a given year. Calculate the single loss expectancy by multiplying the asset value by the exposure. Compute the annualized loss expectancy, ALE, or the money you expect to lose each year. Quantitative risk assessment. 2 of 4. Determine Asset value for each asset in the scope of work. Replacement cost, what does it cost to replace if damaged or lost? Purchase cost, what is the original cost? Depreciation, the original cost reduced by the age factor. Step 2, determine exposure factor. For each risk assessment part, expected amount of money or damage if risk occurs, normally expressed by percentage. Identify annual rate of occurrence by determining the likelihood of risk occurs in a given year. Calculate the single loss expectancy by multiplying the asset value by exposure bracket gives you the amount of money you lose if the risk materializes. Compute the annualized loss expectancy. Qualitative risk assessment. Qualitative risk assessment relies on expert opinions. Experts estimate the probability of the impact on each risk. Organization use the information to evaluate the types of controls we should put in place. Risk management strategies. Risk avoidance. Change business's activities so you no longer incur the risk. Risk acceptance. Acknowledge the risk but take no action. Risk mitigation. Implement controls designed to lessen the probability or impact of risk. Risk transference. Transfer the risk to a third party. Considerations for designing a risk assessment. Create a risk assessment policy. Define goals and objectives. Describe the consistent approach or model. Inventory all IT infrastructures and assets. Determine the value of quantitative or qualitative of each asset. Determine a yardstick or consistent measure and determine critical factors of the assessment. Categorize each assessment placed within the infrastructure and or major. Potential liabilities. Security breach may result in financial risk, criminal prosecutions, or fines. What are risks? Where are risk access needed the most? We have the diagram of a typical network. We have our firewall, the VPN that keeps out the traffic of everything that we want and allows the remote users to get in as needed. How secure must access control be? Value to access and risk to level, cost and convenience. As case studies, private sector, Acme Pharma. Risk is understood in terms of profit and loss and business continuity. How would security breach affect the ability for business to continue? What would it cost to do that? Public sector. Pacific Northwest Laboratories, 3 million attacks per day, 97% of email is spam, 7 layers of defense to protect it. Critical infrastructure. Biggest threat may be risk or damage to infrastructure, loss of IT, physical infrastructure, and risk of assessment. Summary: terms and concepts involved with risk assessment and access control, risk, threats, and vulnerabilities of the IT infrastructure, qualitative and quantitative risk assessment, risk management strategies, how value, situation, and liability affect risk.